Okay, so in this next video, we're going to talk about what what Python is. So Python is a general purpose programming language. You can use it for lots of things. You can use Python to write code for pretty much any programming task. It's used by lots of large organizations, Wikipedia, Google, and so on. So a whole bunch of them that I'm sure you'll recognize. And it's particularly popular for scientific computing and data science, machine learning, natural language processing, because there's some really, really powerful libraries that have been built in Python that allow you to do those things. They're not built into the language itself, but they're available in Python libraries. Okay, so how does it work? Well, it's what's called an interpreted language rather than a compiled language. What that means is that it's translated and run, so it makes the computer work, by another program. A Python interpreter looks at your program, the Python that you've written, and it interprets it one statement at a time and follows that on. The disadvantage of that is that it can be a bit slower than a compiled language, but the advantage is that you don't have to have the whole thing working to make the bit of code that you want to run work. Okay, but you don't need to worry about that for the moment. As I say, if you're using a compiled language, then you have to compile the whole thing. And if you're working with something like Java or C++, something like that, then you'd be using a compiled language. Okay, it's also what's called an object-oriented language. It's a very powerful object orientation. Is a very powerful paradigm for developing reusable software. We're not really going to cover that in this module. We'll just talk about the basics of programming. But later, we've got another module, object-oriented program, where we'll talk about objects and classes. So that's coming up. For the time being, although it's object-oriented, you don't really need to worry about that. Okay, so what do you need to worry about? Well, you need to be able to install it and run it. You can get Python from www.python.org. There's versions for PCs and Macs and any other platform you care to mention. It's all free, and it comes with something called IDLE, which is a development environment. It stands for Integrated Development and Learning Environment, and what that means is it's a way of editing and writing code and even debugging it. And it also includes a thing called the Python shell. Okay, you don't have to use IDLE. You can write Python just in a simple text editor like Notepad or Notepad++, and run it from a command window, but that seems like quite a complicated way around. It's much easier to use IDLE. You can run it online. You can just go to a site called pythonanywhere.com and create an account, and you can run code from there, which is then stored in the browser. Stored in the cloud. You can run it from your browser. It's stored in the cloud. That's an option. Or there's much more sophisticated development environments, more sophisticated than IDLE. And the one we're going to look at a bit later on in this module is called PyCharm. Okay, but for the moment we'll just use IDLE, which is the thing that you get automatically when you download and install Python. And as I said, that includes a thing called the Python shell, and that's perhaps the most basic way of interacting with Python. So you run it by starting up IDLE. Okay, I'm going to do that now. So if you're using a Mac, the instructions are slightly different, but pretty much similar. So I hit the Windows key at the bottom there. I start typing in IDLE. There it is, IDLE Python 3.7 72-bit. And that should start up, and I get a window looking a bit like that, where I can type Python commands in. So you see in that window, there's a little command prompt. This is where I can type stuff, and I can just type in Python commands, or I can use this to run Python programs. We're going to do both of those things in a minute. Okay, and so that's the end of this section on what is Python. Next up, we'll have the first example.